In today's lesson, we'll be looking at the levels of organization in ecology, and we'll be taking a look at 6 various levels of organization, which you see here on the screen. Our essential question today will focus on what the levels of organization within an ecosystem are. So our desired result is similar. It means that you will be able to describe those levels of organization within an ecosystem by the end of today's lesson. Our key terms or vocabulary that you should be on the lookout for include organism, species, population, community, and ecosystem, as well as terrestrial, aquatic, biome, and biosphere. Now let's start with the first level of organization. This is the individual. And of course, individuals consist of organisms. Organisms are simply living things. So an individual is any living thing or any single organism. Now, organisms are able to interact with their environment. They only breed with other individuals that are just like them. And they have all of the characteristics necessary for life. You remember what those are? Those include the use of energy, being able to grow and develop, the ability to reproduce, being made of cells, and the ability to respond to their surroundings. Now let's move up to the one level to population. And if we look at the picture, what do you think population might include? Well, it includes a group of individuals of the same species. So now we're going from the individual to a population. So we're just adding on to each level as we go, as you'll notice. So a population, again, is a group of individuals of the same species. Now, in this case, we're only looking at the goldfish. So a population is this group of organisms that are physically similar to one another. They can mate and they can reproduce, and they can also produce fertile offspring. That means they can produce offspring that can in turn grow up, become mature, and reproduce more fertile offspring as well, which continues the species on through time. Now, one thing to remember is that populations of organisms, they're not always identical. They do have some variations of their various traits, things like what type of hair or fur they might have, their skin color, their eye color, the shape of their eyes, their size. All of these are things that, as you know from our previous lessons, are controlled by small differences in the DNA. But they're still the same species, mainly because they're physically similar and they can reproduce with each other. That's the key. All right, let's move on to the next level, which is community. So what does a community include? Well, if you look at the picture, you'll notice there's jellyfish, a little gray fish, a goldfish, and a little crabby there. Even some grass growing, and grass are living things as well. So they would all be included in a community. So community is basically all of the different populations of different species in an area. So you take multiple species, their entire population, put them together, and you have yourself a community. Now, communities only focus on living things or biotic factors. Biotic meaning living things, right? Biology is the study of life, right? Bio is life, ology is to study. So these are biotic factors, living things, okay? Now, they all also need to be found in the same area or they're not really a community. Your community, whatever neighborhood you live in, is not a community with a community out in Palo Alto, California, or Detroit, Michigan. Those are going to be different communities because they are living in a different area. So you do have to be found in the same area to be considered a community. Now, a working community, one that's functioning well, depends on having lots of different species. This is what we call biodiversity. Our fourth level is the ecosystem. So what do we mean by ecosystem? Well, keep in mind that community only looks at the living things. Ecosystems, on the other hand, are a community of organisms in the same area, just like a community, but it also includes their non-living surroundings. So like the rock and the water that these creatures are living in are all part of their ecosystem. So the community lives within the ecosystem. And there could be multiple communities within that ecosystem. All right, so again, ecosystems include both biotic and abiotic factors. Do you recall those particular terms? I know we've talked about them in class before. So basically, these ecosystems can either be terrestrial, or what we would call land-based, or they can be aquatic or water-based, such as the community we're looking at here in this picture. So when we look at ecology, and ecology is a subset of studies within the overarching biology umbrella, if you will. So when we study ecology, which is the study of ecosystems, we would really focus on this level primarily in order to find out how abiotic factors like sunlight, air, water, and temperature affect living things, or how they all interact with one another. Now, living in that ecosystem on an even larger scale, we come to our next level of organization, and that's called the biome. So a biome is essentially a set of ecosystems that are found around the world, but they are similar in terms of the types of plants and animals that grow there. Now, the reason that they have similar types of plants and animals is primarily based on their annual average temperature, as well as the annual average rainfall in that area. So you can go to one part of the world and you would have similar temperatures and similar amounts of rainfall. You go to another part of the world and likewise you find similar amounts of sunlight and rainfall. So those biomes would be the same, even though they might have different communities, different populations within that biome, even different ecosystems. But nonetheless, some of those biomes would be things like the desert, tropical rainforest, tundra, and even a deciduous forest, which is where we live. Here in Pennsylvania, we live in a deciduous forest biome. Deciduous basically just means changing with the seasons. So our trees will change color in the fall, and the leaves will fall off and they go dormant for the winter. And then in the spring, they spring back to life like they've done over the last month or so. And now we see lots of blooming trees, lots of beautiful flowers popping out of the ground, things like that. So we live in what we call a deciduous forest. So we live in forests, although if there's no trees around you, that's because we've cut them all down in order to build homes and farms and things like that. Okay, so that's a biome. Let's take a look at the biosphere. And this is our last level of organization. So a biosphere is basically everything that makes up living and non-living things upon the earth. So everywhere you can find living things, of course, you'll find non-living things that they interact with there as well. And of course, this is the largest level because there's only one biosphere. So like biomes, we have multiple biomes, we have multiple ecosystems, multiple communities, multiple populations, multiple individuals or species, but there's only one biosphere. And all of these different levels of organization belong inside the biosphere. So we've gone from the very small to the very large. Okay? And as we've gone through each level, we've added more to the pot, so to speak. When we get to biosphere, it's basically including everything, all living things, all non-living things, absolutely everything. All right, so let's look at this from an example of the prairie dogs. Who doesn't love prairie dogs? They're so stinking cute. So we're going to use those as our example. So if you look at one individual prairie dog, we would call that individual an individual or an organism, the prairie dog. But you might find that you have a mama and a papa and a baby prairie dog. That would consist of a population. Now, as we move through and look at a little bit beyond the nuclear family of this cute little prairie dog family, we come to the community, and that would be all of the living things that they would be able to react with in their biome called the prairie. So you see in this picture, there's like a snake, there's some mouse there in the foreground in front of the prairie dogs. Behind them off in the distance, I don't know if you're able to make it out, but there are some buffalo back there. There's also grasses growing around their home, their little hole there. And those are all part of the community. Those are all the living things that they're interacting with. In fact, one of those little prairie dogs looks to be eating something. I don't know what, but they're interacting with their environment in order to eat and survive. Now, if we take their community, which is the living things, and we also look at the non-living things, such as the air, the sunshine, the rain, the water, which we don't see any water in the picture, but there's got to be water somewhere, right? Or they won't survive. There's also dirt and things like that. All of these things contribute to the ecosystem. So the living things and the non-living things. There's some kind of strange bird there, a badger, grasses again. All of these things combine to make up the ecosystem. And that is pretty much how we look at all different organisms and species, and how we look at ecosystems and all of the things that are interacting together and how they interact with one another. All right, so let's think about this question for a moment. The question is, how are populations different from communities? Is it A, populations consist of one species, communities consist of many species? Or is it B, populations can contain plants and fungi, whereas communities consist of animals only? Or is it populations consist of many species and communities consist of only one species? Or could it be letter D, populations consist of animals only and communities can contain plants and fungi? Take a minute and think about that. You can press pause if you want to think about it before the answer is revealed. And so I'll be quiet for a moment, and then we'll look at the answer. Did you decide on an answer? Well, if you did, and you chose letter A, you would be correct. Populations consist of one single species, but communities consist of many different species, many populations of species. All right, good job. Go ahead and answer the questions that follow this video, and we'll see you next time.